The memorial gates are 4 large pillars with bronze urns on top located on Constitution Hill near Buckingham Palace. The memorial commemorates the colonial troops of the British Empire from the Caribbean, Africa, and the 5 areas of the Indian subcontinent who partook in the World Wars. It was erected in 2002 by Her Majesty the Queen and is the only memorial in England commemorating the colonial troops. The underwhelming nature of the memorial gates brings me back to the questions posed by Michelle Barrett, distinguished professor at the University of London, in her article, Subalterns at War. What Barrett questions throughout her article is the clear racial division and lack of and nature of commemorations for colonial soldiers during the war. It's almost clear the racial divide concerned in the memorial gates, being dominated by larger and more famous commemorations around, much like the imperial troops were dominated by their colonial oppressors. This memorial gate greatly confirms the ideas of Barrett that there was little surprise the division from the war bled into the nature of their remembrance. What brings me to my next point is simply the rhetoric used on the memorial. Referring to the colonial soldiers as volunteers is another reason why Indians and other soldiers choose to forget their participation in the war. The reality of war was that these soldiers were fighting for insincere promises of self-governance and often were not really volunteers. When seeing this in person, it was almost laughable to me that on the sole monument for these colonial soldiers, the British still chose to include that they had a choice in fighting in order to sanitize their involvement with the colonies. The gazebo, just left of the gates, is flooded with wreaths of poppies. While my main argument is the lack of commemoration and remembrance for the colonial troops, this could go to show that some have chosen not to forget the awful situation their ancestors were put in, but rather celebrate it. This contradicts the idea of Barrett slightly, but overall is still relevant to her focuses. While this may seem like many tokens of remembrance, when viewing other memorials close by, this seems minuscule in comparison. At the top of the gazebo, there are many names listed under the honor of the Victorian Cross. Again, this goes along with Barrett's notions that only high-ranking and honorable soldiers were recognized. While I do understand it would be difficult to commemorate all 5 million soldiers, I feel simply saying 5 million is not enough. I felt it to be an inadequate remembrance for a group of people that were such a large piece in the war. At the Imperial War Museum, the abundance of colonial troop artifacts was abysmal, which I found to be strange due to the museum being named the Imperial War Museum, and without their colonies, the British would not have been able to even consider this name. This recruitment poster explains the early life of a recruit, boasting good food, pay, treatment, and healthy life. As Indian politician and member of Parliament Shashi Tharoor explains in his article, India Looks Back on the First World War, the experiences of Indians in the war were far from pleasant. The reality of Indian participation was rooted in the racial divide explained by Barrett and the maltreatment the British imposed on their colonies. Another artifact I encountered was this book showing the Prince of Wales in traditional Indian dress. Similar to the way the gazebo only lists names of higher-ranking officers, this shows, even though he is in Indian clothing, he is still a royal Brit. This act of simply remembering the British officers is what Barrett argues creates the racial divide. The plaque explaining the artifact accurately explains the Amritsar massacre, which I do appreciate, though as it is not attempting to sanitize the fact that the British were awful to their colonies. In the National Army Museum, I found within the museum's entirety only a few things were included from Indian soldiers. While I did find artifacts from many other wars, the Indian participation in World War I was often overlooked. One of the only pieces I found was this graph. As you can see, the pink shading is the number of Indian soldiers, with almost as many Indian soldiers as British. What I really enjoyed about this specific exhibit was the truth behind the caption. Troops from colonies didn't always have a say in fighting for the British Army. While some, like journalist Andrew Roberts, argue this only pushes colonial guilt onto the present-day museum goer, I think it assists slightly in showing the reality of the colonial troops rather than simply calling them volunteers. Looking back at the gates and artifacts, much like Barrett and Tharoor, I found the memorials and lack of representation in museums is extremely evident. In both the Imperial War Museum and National Army Museum, the quantity of artifacts from over 1 million colonial soldiers was less than impressive. It is no wonder their participation is often overlooked and forgotten. It was definitely crucial to see the memorials and artifacts in real life, because online you're unable to see just how underwhelming these commemorations are in reality.